Hi, y'all. It's hard to believe that we are at the end point of our class and that we have managed to zoom through a semester's worth of thinking in 6 weeks. This is the last readings video of the course, and I want to be sure to engage in the ideas of the reading so you can do a comprehension check, but also to prepare you for both your last weekly writing assignment and last visual discussion, but then also for your final paper. Um, and specifically, to come back around to the question that we started with in the course, which is why is it important to think philosophically about education, right? Why is this how we should be spending our time, right? Thinking philosophically about education. And especially our last reading is going to loop us around to that after we consider some ideas about quality. So, all of the readings in this module ask us to think beyond the common sense about school quality. So, in the general public, or policymakers, when we talk about school quality, we're going to hear things like test scores, graduation rates, college matriculation rates, career readiness, civic readiness, attendance, right? AP enrollment. We're going to hear these very quantitative ideas about how we measure school quality, none of which can fully capture the experience of an education within a school. And all of these readings really are arguing that none of those quantifiable measures can actually capture the true measure of educational quality, in part because they miss the mark on what the purpose of education is. So, how do these readings consider these questions of quality and also purpose and also philosophy? Let's start with Grace Lee Boggs. So, Grace Lee Boggs is a civil rights activist, an Asian American woman from Detroit. She lived in Detroit. She worked with youth and civil rights organizers in Detroit, particularly on intersectional issues within the civil rights movement. And Grace Lee Boggs is making an argument about school quality that really challenges the very notion of what schooling is in a city. And she's specific that she is talking about, because the piece is called Education in Our Dying Cities, right? What does she mean by a dying city? She, again, is talking specifically from her position in Detroit, but what she describes should resonate with Milwaukee, with Chicago, with Cleveland, with Minneapolis, with San Francisco, with any city, really, because every city in America has racially and economically segregated neighborhoods that are dispossessed of resources, that are cut off from city wealth, that are almost like a different world than the downtown hip neighborhoods that so many of us are familiar with as college students and young professionals, right? So Grace Lee Boggs' argument about quality is that education should ultimately be about community building in this context. And by community building, she means, yes, the skills and capacity to engage in community self-determination, community improvement, but also relational community building, relational capacity building, so that youth can become agents for social change, so that youth can become actors, empowered actors in their world to push back against the forces of dispossession and the forces of oppression that have created the circumstances in which they live. So she really asks us to think beyond education as an instrumental activity for a job, right? She asks us to think beyond instrumental ideas of education being an economic training ground, to think about education as community building and as a force of social change in dispossessed and oppressed communities. And for my education students, you should see a lot of overlap between what Grace Lee Boggs is describing and what we talk about all the time pedagogically and methodologically, right? We see inquiry, we see relevance, we see place-based education, we see student-centered ed. All of that's in Grace Lee Boggs. You should see connections to John Dewey, to Paulo Freire, to Maria Montessori, to Jean Piaget, right? You should see connections to the inquiry model from social studies and science, right? You should see all of this at work in Grace Lee Boggs, because in essence, what all of these other pedagogical approaches have in common, and what they're arguing, is what Grace Lee Boggs is arguing, that the purpose of education is more than instrumental about my getting a job, my getting into college, and my getting a job. That the purpose of education in a democratic society is about community and capacity building and soul enrichment, right? Soul nourishment, which we're going to come back to in a minute when we talk about Bettina Love and mattering. Okay, but let's talk about Pedro Arrupe next. So this is a former superior general of the Jesuits. So he's writing from an explicitly Ignatian Catholic perspective. But the reason I include it is because often when we listen to Ignatian educators, when we listen to Jesuits talk about education, there is a moral clarity, understanding the way in which education is meant to equip us morally and ethically in the world. And Arrupe is specifically asking us to think about the quality of our education based on how it equips us with the moral and ethical capacity to walk in solidarity with the dispossessed and the oppressed. Remember, that is how Jesuits, how in Ignatian pedagogy, how we think about justice, right? Walking in solidarity with the oppressed and the dispossessed in order to transform our social reality, the world we live in, towards, in the words of Ignatian pedagogy and in the words of Catholicism and the gospel, right, towards love. A world towards God's will here on earth, right? How do we transform our world towards that? It's a way of thinking about justice. And so he's calling on us to think about how our education equips us to engage in justice work, and that's the measure of a quality education. Okay, so Bettina Love, who is a powerhouse of a speaker and a writer, and I encourage you to look up any of her talks. Some of you are familiar with her work from other education classes. But Bettina Love brings us this idea of mattering and is really asking us to think about educational quality as being about an education that communicates to us that we matter. Specifically, Bettina Love is writing from the perspective of Black and Brown students and the ways in which schooling typically tells Black and Brown students that they don't matter, the way in which it's soul-sucking. And she's asking us to think about educational quality as one that is enriching, one that enriches and validates and builds on our souls, our identities, our social consciousness, our social context, that communicates to us that as we are now, not as a test score, not as something we might be in the future, but as we are now, we matter. You should see connections there with ideas of care, but also our ideas of justice, right, from earlier in the course. And also around epistemology, right? Also around the purpose of education. You should see connections with all of those in terms of this idea of mattering. And mattering is deeply connected in Bettina Love's work with the idea of freedom dreaming, of looking at the world that we exist in now, one in which so many are marginalized, right? In which Black and Brown folks face oppression on multiple levels, where intersectional identities, right? Those who sit at intersections of queerness, of gender, of race, the ways that they are systematically dehumanized on a daily basis in our society. Freedom dreaming looks at all of that and says, so what else can be? And here you should see connections with Lacey's article on Ea Curia and his thinking about justice, right? And imagining what a just world can be. And mattering in schools allows students to engage in that freedom dreaming alongside their teachers. That's a really powerful idea. Okay, so then there is Quentin Wheeler Bell, who talks about education as equipping us with a spirit of activism. So he is really asking us to think about educational quality as how it orients us, kind of like Grace Lee Boggs, how it orients us toward a disposition for social change, right? How do we understand our role in a collective towards making the world a better place? So you should see connections between Wheeler Bell, Grace Lee Boggs, Arupe, and Bettina Love. And across all four of these, you should also see really explicit connections to all of the philosophical concepts that we've talked about, right? That we cannot talk about educational quality without also engaging in questions of aims. What is the purpose of education? Epistemology. What do we know? What is worth knowing? How do we know it? Without engaging with questions of care. What does it look like to express care or to express love in education? To engage with questions of freedom or liberation. What is possible in terms of a liberatory education? To engage in questions of justice. What is justice in education? What is a just education? That we have to engage with all of these concepts in order to answer that question, what is a quality education? And so you can begin to see how narrow our public discourse is when we talk about educational quality only in terms of those instrumental ideas, right? Test scores, college engagement, all that's important, right? We want people to be able to exist safely and healthfully in the world that exists now. And so we need jobs, right? Jobs today typically require some kind of training. We want people, we don't have a robust social safety net, so we need people to be able to be economically secure and self-sufficient. So there are a lot of reasons why we need those instrumental measures, but they don't capture a true purpose or quality of education. Okay, so this all brings us back to that central question of why should we even think philosophically about education? And it brings us to the final piece on the snapshots of a philosophy of education in the year 2020, which gives us a number of ways to think about why we engage philosophically in the world of education, right? And the various authors in this piece call on us to attend to the lived social context of schooling and of education. That we cannot think philosophically about education, and thus we cannot educate, right? In a meaningful way unless we attend to contexts like Black Lives Matter, COVID, right? Economic crises, racial crises, health crises. Unless we attend to all of that, our education is embedded in it. And philosophers of education should be, the authors argue, should be looking at this intersection, how they influence one another. We also, the authors in this last piece, call on us to think about how our philosophical ideas actually interact with educational spaces, and that should be bi-directional, meaning that we think philosophically about education, and then we try to enact that, and then what happens comes back and helps us think philosophically about education. That we should be operating at two different levels that are intersecting and in dialogue, right? That we are thinking theoretically, that we are imagining, that we are freedom dreaming, in the words of Bettina Love, but we are also practicing, and that those two things are in a discourse with one another. And that the philosophy of education, in that act of freedom dreaming, should help us reimagine what is possible in schools. Not just in an idealistic way, but within the constraints that we live in, within that social context, within these systems. So we can imagine, and we should imagine, what it looks like beyond the system that exists now. And that imagining, that dreaming, that looking beyond will also help us enact something more just, more robust, higher quality, more meaningful in the world that exists now. So I hope that helps you make sense of how these pieces all fit together and why we end with this idea of quality, because in many ways it encapsulates everything that we've talked about thus far.